this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Mona Haveri. Mona is the founder, executive director, and chairman of the board at SoundEffects. She launched SoundEffects to address the Valley of Death, the growing gap in funding that constrains the translation of cancer research discoveries into clinical applications. As cancer affects millions of Americans each year, national efforts to cure this disease have largely focused on cancer research rather than cancer product development. Mona believes that the key to bridging the Valley of Death is to first, raise public awareness, and second, create a funding platform. Mona holds a doctorate in biochemistry from the Bowman Gray School of Medicine of Wake Forest University. She trained as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Cancer Institute. Mona was granted the Spohr Fellowship Award for breast cancer research at the Lombardi Cancer Center of Georgetown University. She subsequently specialized in intellectual property and technology transfer while at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer. So welcome, Mona.
Thank you, Don, for having me.
And so tell us a little bit about your career. What led you to where you are now?
Yeah, as we spoke earlier, I'm a cancer researcher. I did a lot of my work at the National Cancer Institute. That was where I did my postdoctoral training. And from there, I spun out a company, and the company was based, and the technology was actually founded in the lab at the National Cancer Institute. And through that journey, I understood how hard it is to take an innovation that was born in a laboratory and then traverse it into a new industry, the biotech industry, and raise money and hit milestones. And I realized that inevitably people like me and companies like mine were falling in this place that we call the Valley of Death, which isn't a real place. It's a metaphorical place, right? Where innovations lack the critical resources or financial resources to move forward. And so we have all these great ideas that are hanging out there, but because they don't have the proper funding, they quote unquote die in this valley of death. And actually, it's to the detriment of society because there are so many people that need solutions to their health issues. And yet on the other side of the equation, there's so many creators out there working on solutions that just can't get it off the ground. And the problem is that we have a disconnect between those who need new medicines, new treatments, new therapies, and those who are developing. We actually don't talk. And this is what I saw was a big problem. And I realized it's not just a problem for those of us that are working in companies. It's a problem. It's a societal problem. And that's what inspired me to launch SoundEffects, which is really a charity. And what SoundEffects is a charitable crowdfunding platform for innovators who are working on cancer solutions, but that want to raise funds, non-dilutive funds. Our platform offers them a way to raise those funds through the charitable donors that see a solution and want to get behind it.
Thank you for that. What is the chance that, so you have something that's novel? It sounds like you were working at the National Cancer Research Institute. And so out of that, what are the chances that something that actually might have been a cure for something, gets killed in the Valley of Death?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think the answer is we don't know that exact number. What are they? Because if we did know, we'd know how efficient or non-efficient we are at moving inventions from one side to the other, from the lab to hopefully the patient. But I can say from my personal experience, it seems to me that there's no shortage of people innovating. There really isn't. And there's probably no shortage of patents being filed. But what's not clear is once they are filed, who's championing these technologies and how are they championing and how are we to raise the funding around them? And I think that's the other bottleneck. It's not simply money, but it's also the champion around the technology and the people or the team that's willing to move it and to work on it. And I recently read the book Loonshot by Safi Bahcall. And have you read this book?
No, I have not.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the concept of loonshot is the opposite of moonshot, which, as we know, moonshots are great ideas that we put resources behind. And loonshots are ideas that no one wants to get around, ignored. And yet it's been shown in history over and over that it's often loonshots that had a champion that figured out how to get some money under it that then became something that we as people use every day or need or has improved our lives. And so I see all these innovations as just that. They're just ideas with warts right now that nobody wants to cultivate, but somebody will. And that's what's going to help us move it out of this valley of death and into potentially something productive.
So how long ago did you start Sound Effects?
Yeah. So I actually was thinking about Sound Effects, say, in 2012. And by maybe 2014, we finally got the 501c3 status, put together a team, and we launched a website. But it was shortly after launching it that we realized Sound Effects had its own problems. And the problem wasn't actually setting up a crowdfunding platform. I mean, that was the easy thing to do, the website, the platform. You launch some social media. The actual idea isn't so novel, right, or innovative. In fact, Sound Effects was built with as an offshoot of something like a Kickstarter. Do you know what Kickstarter is?
Sure.
And you know how in Kickstarter, it was built for creatives, but really for musicians or people who are making movies or people in the arts that were creating, and they couldn't get investors around their creations. So they formed Kickstarter to get their crowd and their people to support it. So I thought to myself, we should do that. We need a Kickstarter, but for cancer. And that's how it was envisioned. But our big problem was the public doesn't know what biotech innovations are. We've always been siloed as cancer researchers and innovators. The challenge here is how do we now bridge the two worlds? How do we bridge people who care about this issue with people who are innovating to solve the problems? And that's where the music component came in. And that's where we felt like we need to capitalize on a bridge that will help us get innovators into the popular culture and bring this to people so that cancer innovations and the word biotech and all these new ideas that are coming out of our world just become household conversations and dinner table conversations. Did you hear about CRISPR, or did you hear about this gene therapy or immunology or CAR T, whatever it might be? If we can do this with gaming and if we can do this with all kinds of apps, we can do this with biotech too. And that was the idea that musicians would lead us to a greater acceptance of what we're about.
So how does music, just to go a little bit further, so how then does music play a role? So what specifically do you do then with music?
Yeah, so that's another good question. And that was another kind of experiment in and of itself, because we knew we wanted to we knew we wanted to capitalize on music as our torch. But what we didn't know is how we were going to do it. And of course, we could do what other charities have done, because it's not novel to bring music into a cause. And what other charities do is they find celebrities and they put concerts together, or they put galas and this kind of thing. But for us, we couldn't do that. First of all, we just didn't have the resources to make all that happen. And celebrities are expensive and you need deep pockets and came with risk. And so we thought, okay, if we can't get the celebrities, why not emerging artists? In fact, they're influencers in their own right. But that too, they were easier to get to, and they certainly were hungrier. They were hungrier to join a cause and to get onto something. And we needed people to be our influencers of our own cause versus maybe a celebrity that's already tied up in other causes. But the emerging artists were eager to jump on something new and new thinking. And so they became perfect for us. And so we started reaching emerging artists, and we found that there's millions of them. There's just so many of them all over the world. And so we started collecting them. And so on our platform, we have basically a roster of artists. Maybe right now we have 100, but our vision is to have thousands. And then what we do with the artists is we do not do galas. We stick to our virtual theme, which is to hold challenges, virtual fundraising challenges, very much like an ice bucket idea, where we tell the artists, okay, guys, we're going to hold a challenge, and the ones that raise the most are going to get a meeting with a record label, or they're going to get a special performance like with South by Southwest, or something that they care about that would give them exposure. And sure enough, we found that if we incentivized, we could get the results that we wanted. And so that's how we started fundraising. And it took me then to figure out how to get my reach into the music industry, which of course I had none because I'm not a musician. I'm a cancer researcher. And it made me have to knock on a lot of doors, and that took time, but it worked and doors opened. So there is a testament to, if you have the vision and you keep at it, people will jump on it. You'll get the connections that you need. And that's what it was. And it wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, and it took being able to network my way in and share the story where people would get around it that have no idea what biotech is and cancer innovation is. Because really, if we're honest, what was happening is that the public and the music industry was understanding that we haven't found the cure. We put money into research, and then researchers are going to find the cure. And then once they find the cure and we're sick, we're going to buy it from like Merck or Pfizer, right? There wasn't an understanding that there is this place in the middle that research simply creates discoveries, but the discoveries had to be advanced. And the people to do that were these entrepreneurs and the industry that we call biotech. And that's not their fault. It's just, we just don't have leaders to share it and to tell them that this is the system and they can be part of this system. And I think SoundFX found its role to do just that, is to bring them into this conversation and to augment the efforts of innovators.
Yeah, and I guess a couple of points come to mind for me. So one is, we know that the most interesting molecules oftentimes are the ones that the big drug companies hang on to. Those are the ones that they have the most promise and things like that. But they do spin off an awful lot of other molecules that could potentially be a cure for a certain type of cancer, or potentially be the one thing that we all need right out in the public to help cancer patients in the future. So it is an interesting, thought to think that companies like yours can help these companies that are in that position, trying to take something that wasn't the mainstream molecule that everybody's going after, but one of these sideline things that just might be the thing that can't, cures the, top 6% of cancer patients or something.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of this discussion, because it seems to me, when I talk to a lot of people who have started up biotechs, funding and what ultimately the game for biotech is to appeal to the investor. Ultimately. And then that means that who's making the decisions as to what moves forward and what doesn't. It's certainly not the people who are sick. It's investors, frankly. And then investors are looking at They have a very narrow box in terms of what they wish to move forward and what they don't. And the landscape of tools is, while the public believes when they donate to cancer organizations, they have a social contract, right, with these organizations that we're going to donate to research for the cure. And that's going to create the panoply of tools that we need once we're sick. But that's not what happens. And they're not aware of that. They aren't aware that's not really how the system happens. So I think SoundFX perhaps offers a way for the public to rally around tools that investors may not be. And I don't, of course, blame investors. Investors are wearing their investor hat. They're looking for their financial return on investment. But the people are looking for an impact return, a health return. And the two don't necessarily line up. And I think that, again, somewhere we've got to reconcile what makes money and what saves lives or what improves lives are not necessarily the same. And so I think this, again, becomes another place for SoundFX to advance this conversation and maybe be a way for the public to get involved, because clearly in cancer, there's so many issues that, first of all, there's so many cancers, right? And secondly, so many of these cancers are truly not addressed. And then on top of it, even if they are addressed, there's various aspects of treatments that can create more problems. Like maybe it's infections, maybe it's swelling and we don't have a way to deal with that. Maybe it's vascular problems. There's just problems upon problems upon problems, just even in one cancer with the current treatments that we have. And then there's so many cancers. So you take something like breast cancer that, okay, stage 1 or 2 is solved very differently than how we're going to address stage 3 or 4. And then when cancers metastasize, we still don't have a way to deal with that effectively. And so when we talk about breast cancer, we actually got to talk about it as many diseases, because there's still aspects of it that we can't solve. And yet we have advocacy groups that are rooting for breast cancer, but we need to even divide those groups up, because the ones that are where it is working, that's great. But then there's people that are late stage with cancer that is spread to their brain, and there's just not enough going on there's not enough solutions for them. So I guess somehow we need to bridge research with innovation, with pharma, with advocacy, with the public. And I say the public, and I say that very strongly, because the people that are sick are only a subset of the people who care and want to see change. If what pharma has done is to focus mainly on advocates, and even BIO, the organization BIO, I feel there's a lot more focus on advocacy and patient advocacy, and a lot less focus on the culture, on the popular culture at large, who in fact is a stakeholder and in fact could be very powerful in creating change.
Yeah, this idea of crowdsourcing a therapy, right? Just really, it takes almost a total mind shift. And until you started really diving into the topic, I didn't really understand the approach of SoundFX and really what it is that you are looking to do, other than you were helping companies or wanting to focus on helping companies through this valley of death. Obviously, critically important in the overall space. And one of the things I've been asking guests lately is, how has COVID-19 and the impact of where we are today impacted your organization and, what you're trying to do?
Yeah. And in fact, I think the COVID-19 era has been fascinating, and it's been really incredible. In fact, I would say it's almost augmented our efforts. First of all, we've got a lot of companies working on cancer that are now pivoting into COVID, which is great. And in some cases, they come on our platform and they want to raise money around these ways that they were detecting cancer or treating. Well, now they can pivot and do this for COVID. Secondly, what's really remarkable is now the public has become sensitized to a whole new conversation around vaccines, around testing. PCR, nobody knew what that was. Lab developed tests, the FDA, all these things that no one talked about are now all we hear about, including, for example, Fauci, who we all know, but the public didn't know. And now he's a guy in the public space. But we need more scientists in the public space. We need more of those leaders. And even the idea of bridging people with science and the scientific community is become a huge part of the national discussion. We need to rely on our scientists. We need to rely on our innovators. This has become a huge part of the discussion. And what do our federal institutions doing? Are we believing in them? Are we not? And all of this, in my opinion, has augmented what SoundFX is about. And I think, if anything, this has put us in a place. It's all the years you asked me when I started, and I said we launched in 2014. But when we launched, we were just beaten down. People didn't understand. What is this crowd? What? Why is this important? Not only from the public perspective, but even from the biotech perspective. There was tremendous fear about biotechs going on a public platform to reach the public and raise money from the public. There was tremendous fear around that. And so every year when we realized there were more crowd platforms and more crowd movements, SoundFX became more digestible about bridging these two worlds. And so our main hurdles wasn't the actual idea. It was cultural hurdles, cultural within biotech and cultural within our popular culture about what it is and why it matters and why we should think about it. And even just all these words are intimidating, but now they've become common. So I think for us, it's been huge in terms of advancing what we're all about.
It's a great overall journey and story. And I look forward to seeing more and more about what SoundFX is doing in terms of ways that people can get involved in SoundFX or even look into what you're doing. Can you tell them more about how they would find out more about your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So if there are companies that want to get on our platform and raise money through the charitable crowd, check out our website. It's soundfx.org. If you're generally interested, check out our campaigns that we're launching. And certainly if you're a musician, we'd love to have you on board. As well, also, we're across all social media. And you can find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. So we'd certainly love to connect with those interested.
That's great. And I will provide links to all of those as well. So
appreciate it.
Yeah. So I have 3 questions that I like to ask everybody that I interview. And as we get ready to close out the interview here. So number 1, what inspires you?
Yeah, for me, I think the innovators, they inspire me, their energy, their drive to find solutions in a place where people really suffer. And it's so easy to be negative. And I think why I love SoundFX and why I love what I do is I get to be around all these people that just have ways of solving problems, and they're so excited.
Phenomenal. And then what concerns you? What keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I do think a lot about how are we going to get this conversation to the people. I would say this has been the number one challenge, and it's taken so much creativity, so much knocking on doors. How do we do this? How do we get people to, because what we're asking is, and what I feel what's happening, and it has happened throughout, is charity is always been this kind of world where we ask people to support the person who's poor, the person who's homeless, or the person who's been bad. Like it's been a person-to-person thing. But how can we ask people to support a new system, a new way of doing things? Because people get drawn in by the individuals, but how do we draw people in by changing the system, which is why the individuals are where they are, if you will. And in our case, it's the valley of death, right? This is a systemic problem. How do we get people to buy into this valley of death and not just the person who's passed away from cancer? Like that, they're the reason why they are the outcome of why we can't get innovations through. And if we could potentially save more lives and have better outcomes for people. So we want to connect these dots. And I would say for me, this is what I think about a lot.
Thank you for that. And then lastly, what excites you? What really makes you jump out of bed in the morning?
Yeah, I think what makes me jump out of bed and getting back to the beginning is when the potential for these quote unquote loon shots, for these ideas that we're never going to get looked at, but now there's a way. Now there's a path. For me, and it's so pivotal in this moment in time when we're battling COVID, that we, in fact, advance all these great ideas that are just sitting there and need a champion. And they need the champion of people like yourself, but also the public to bring them in. So I would say that to me is what excites me the most.
Yeah, by far, I'm only creating a medium, but companies like you really are creating a path. So thank you for your work. Thank you for what you're doing with sound effects. And most of all, thank you for being a guest on the show. I greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you, Don. And really appreciate that you enabled me to be on this show. This is a real privilege. And letting me share about my journey in sound effects is really great. So thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.